All right, hello. Hopefully the people on Zoom can hear me now. All right. So, first off, let's start off with the main question. What actually is game feel? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, especially when like talking about just like how you can improve on a game, but no one can really like give a concrete definition. And that's kind of because it is kind of hard to define. According to the very first search result I found, which is Wikipedia, the tangible game feel is the tangible tactile sensation experience when interacting with video games. So how I like to define it is just how do we make mundane actions inside of a game feel good to play? So, for example, let's take like a shooter. How do we make the actual action of shooting feel good to do? Not just like, oh, click to shoot, but also you get that tactile feedback of like, yeah, I'm actually firing a gun. Or for example, let's say you're like platformer. How do we make the act of jumping feel good? Also, to everyone coming in, please sit in the front rows, not in the back tables. All right. So yeah, and I'm going to be discussing how we can do that for specifically platformers, but general rule of thumb to most other things. So one thing that we can do to kind of improve game feel is to improve the controls. So obviously controls are what you're going to be using to interact with your game. It may be a gamepad, it may be your keyboard, maybe mouse, whatever you use, doesn't matter. Guitar Hero controller, people do that apparently for a lot of games. But the idea for controls is you want to keep it simple and comfortable in most cases. Of course, this is a general rule of thumb. It does not apply to all games, but in most cases, you want to keep it simple and comfortable. The best controls that you can make is a set of controls where the player doesn't even notice that they're using a controller at all. Increasing the important key here, player immersion. So you don't want a player to like physically be thinking about like, oh, I need to press this button, this button, this button to kind of do your certain actions. You want to kind of design your controls in a way that it just all flows naturally. And then eventually, after a couple hours of play, they don't even notice that they're actually pressing buttons. At this point, they're fully immersed into whatever game that you're making. And it's almost as if they are the character themselves. You kind of break that like game/player boundary for like a fully immersive experience. So how do we do this? Specifically for a platformer. So in most cases, when you're designing controls for like a controller, such as the gamepad up here, typically want to separate what I'm going to call movement versus action. So D-pad obviously will control your left and right movement. That's pretty obvious. But one important key thing that I want to note is jumping. So typically we think of jumping as part of movement. So most people, the intuitive first thought is like, okay, if we're going to put a jump, we're going to put it on like the up D-pad area. That makes sense. You press up, the player goes up. However, if you've actually held a controller and tried like using the D-pad for jumping, it is incredibly uncomfortable. Imagine trying to hold the left button and then shifting your thumb over to the up arrow key just to jump every single time. So that's why usually in most games, they separate out the jump button onto one of the face buttons. So like, for example, on the PlayStation controller here, I'd map the jump button to like X or something. That way, you don't have kind of like all of your controls clustered in the same area. Just giving your player just more space to move around and just keep their hands from like cramping, shifting their thumb all over the place. So in this case, I would separate this basically to movement and then action, and then jumping would be considered like an action. Of course, if your game is a lot more complicated, you could map more actions to the other face buttons. But the main thing here is jumping is considered an action. Therefore, it should be separated from the general movement controls. So how does this translate to, let's say, a keyboard? So in most cases, the D-pad issue doesn't really exist on a keyboard. So You can map like the jump button to the up arrow. It's comfortable enough because you have more fingers on a keyboard, so you can press like left, right with your ring and index finger. Middle finger can control up and down movement. But for the sake of like clarity and just separating things out, most games still prefer to map actions to Z, X, and C. So in some games, like I'll take Celeste for example, despite the up arrow being like right there for like jumping or like any upwards movement, they still prefer to map the jump button to the C key just to have that kind of separation. Now, that being said, though, this is just one way that you can map controls. This isn't like a definitive way of like, okay, this is exactly how you do it. If your game specifies something different, obviously don't follow this guideline. It might not apply to every game that you play. For example, the Getting Over It, if you guys heard of that game before, this control scheme will not work at all for that game. So you'll want to tune kind of this ideology to the game that you're making. Don't just follow this blindly. And most important of all, even if you have a very set control that you want to establish, so like movement is this, jumping is this, always allow for additional accessibility options. One key flaw of like both of the control systems that I've laid out here is that it's very two-handed. So let's say, for example, you have a player who is unable to use one hand. Well, clearly they just can't use half of the controls in this case. So whenever you're thinking about controls, yes, think about like, oh, how is it best to map these controls onto whatever preferred controller that they have, but also and allow the ability to remap those controls in case someone has some kind of disability where they can't use the exact set of controls that you've laid out. It just allows for more people to play your game. All right. So next up, specifically for platformers, one way you can greatly increase like the game field of a game is acceleration curves. So how would you guys typically do movement? I would assume that most of you, first time making a platformer, you'd probably say, okay, if I have a platforming character, I have these set actions. So the player can move left, the player can move right, they can jump, and that's about it. However, when you think about it, that doesn't really mimic real life movement very well, because like I can't think of anything in real life that can immediately snap to the left or snap to the right on a dime. So that's where acceleration curves come in. So acceleration curves kind of mimic real life motion where like obviously an object has to speed up first before getting it to a max speed and then slow down when the button is released. So here, like this is kind of a very generic acceleration curve. So the first time you hold like a button, so let's say left or right, your character starts speeding up until it reaches kind of a max speed. You hold that button until however long you want to, until you finally want to stop moving, where there's a sharp drop off and deceleration. Now, this acceleration curve does not apply to every game. You can adjust this to however way you want your game to feel. So for example, if you have an acceleration that's really quick, you have a game that feels really snappy. The moment you press a button, immediately full speed ahead. And then once you release a button, if you have a short deceleration, you stop on a dime. On the other hand, let's take a game where like an auto runner, where you kind of want to be jumping across large distances, speeding along, trying to build up momentum. In that case, you'll want to extend your acceleration curve way out so that it's much longer. So you kind of get that feeling of buildup as you keep running and running. And obviously, to compensate for that, you also want to increase your max speed so that you really get a sense of like forward motion. Same with the deceleration. If you want a very momentum-based game where you're building up speed, you'll typically want your deceleration to be also very long so that in case like they mess up, they accidentally crash into a wall or they press the wrong key, they don't instantly like drop off all momentum. They have a bit of leeway so that like they can maintain some of their speed even if like they make a mistake. So another key part of platforming. So this is obviously your movement, but like, what about jumping? So that comes into jump arcs. So there are two key factors that affect like how your character will jump. There is the initial velocity, which is basically like how much momentum is pushing your character up. And the next is gravity. So what is pulling your character down? So these two factors are really important to determine like what kind of arc you want your character to move in. And you'll typically want to tune these arcs to fit whatever level design that you have. So for example, let's say you have like a platform that is about yay high. You don't want to use this top jump arc here because you'll be flying over every single platform in your level. That's not going to be fun. Well, it could be fun. I don't know what the game you're making, but typically you want to tune your control so that it's exactly onto that first platform. Same thing if you use the smaller arc, you're not going to make any platform in general. So it's not going to be very fun if your player is stuck on the very first jump because they can't jump high enough. Now, one thing I do want to note is, while typically we think of gravity as like a constant force, we're in the video game realm. We don't actually have to adhere to the laws of physics. We can adjust the gravity on the fly if we feel the need to. So, for example, in Celeste, a really hard platformer, they do compensate for like having very difficult jumps by lowering the gravity right around like the tip of the arc. So why do they do that? By lowering the gravity, it gives you a much longer time at the top of your jump arc to give you more control midair. So like, let's say you've made it up to the jump and then you realize, oh wait, I kind of wanted to go a little more this way. By lowering the gravity at the top of the arc, it gives them a little more time to compensate for like, okay, I need to move a little more this way to actually land on the platform. Whereas if you just follow the direct jump arc, there's a potential where like, well, they can't control themselves in midair no more, so they just miss. So these two factors you could adjust and like tweak to whatever game that you want to really make it feel a lot better. So yeah. All right. So I've talked a lot about jumping. I've talked a lot about acceleration curves, jumping. So how about we try it in an actual example? And this is why I asked everyone to come up. So does anyone want to volunteer to try this game out? Controller's right here. Don't be shy. Go for it.
No.
All right. So very simple, left, right, and then the X button is jump. Tell me how this game feels to you.
All right. No. Okay, so generously, it's a little hinky. I don't feel much. There's a little bit of a delay when I jump when I actually like vertically accelerate.
Do you feel the speed of your character? Do you feel in control here?
I feel like that guy on IGN. Yeah, I don't know. There's not much feedback to the jump and the movements a bit more.
Yeah. So can you say that this is probably a very bad way to like set your platforming controls?
Could use some improvement, I would say.
Could use a lot of improvement, yes. So what this default control scheme here, just feel free to hold on to the controller, don't worry. This default control scheme here, I literally made in like 10 minutes. This is just for all the programmers who kind of know what's going on. I just said like, okay, rigid body set velocity X to whatever direction, and then when they jump, set the upward velocity to a certain number. And that's all I did. I didn't tune this at all. And it feels sluggish, it feels floaty, it doesn't feel right. Now, if you could press the triangle button. I have made this in a way where you can tweak every single part of the platformer. So in this case, what we just discussed, jump arcs and acceleration. Let's mess with the acceleration first. So at the bottom of the controller. Let's turn on the acceleration curves. So deselect nodes acceleration. Now these three factors can actually come into play. So does anyone want to try this out? Go for it. So yeah. These three sliders control how quickly your character can move, how quickly your character accelerates max speed, and how quickly it slows down to 0. So feel free to adjust it and see if you can tweak it to feel a little better than what we had initially. Well, let's not touch the gravity. We'll talk about the cheats later. I heard someone mention it. There you go. So can you guys see how, like, by increasing the speed and just adjusting the acceleration / deceleration, it gives you more control over like your in-air movement? So now it's not just like, okay, we're just gonna slowly crawl over to the left or right. Now you have a bit more leeway in moving. You can actually get to places. All right. We still have an issue here though. So yes, now you can move left and right better, but the jump still feels incredibly floaty. Like we're not making like a space level here. We just want to make like a typical platformer. So let's adjust our gravity and jump height. So if you'll open up the menu. So obviously jump height controls how high you jump, and then gravity controls how strong gravity is. Also, feel free to mess around. If you want to set it to no gravity and a max jump height. Okay, so you can see how just like by adjusting these settings a little bit, this feels a lot more playable. You have more control. The jumping feels a lot better to use. All right, let's stop here. So as you can see, by adjusting the controls, one thing that I didn't show is like there are also alternate controls here. So X is obviously jump, but you can also use the up arrow to jump. However, you can see that like trying to jump solely using the D-pad is kind of uncomfortable. Like I'm finagling my thumb to both jump and move at the same time. It's just not very active. So you'll typically want to separate these two actions out so that one finger can control movement, the other hand can control jumping. All right. So we've tuned our controls to make the game feel a lot better, but it still feels kind of static. Like it's kind of just a block that just jumps. How does that make sense? Like in a real world context, just a solid block, it doesn't really make sense for it to just randomly accelerate upwards in a jump or just move left or right. So we can kind of fix that by implementing animation and effects. So you'll typically see this in a lot of games, for example, first off, character animation. The goal here, I'm not going to delve into animation specifically. I'm mainly going to talk about how character animation can provide feedback to the player. So, for example, during the platformer that we just showed, there's not much feedback for when you jump. You kind of just do it, but you don't feel like the character is actually jumping. You want to give the player some kind of feedback that like they did an action and it was successful. So, for example, One technique that a lot of games is flashing a knockback, typically games that involve combat. By flashing and like moving the enemy back, give it a little knockback, you feel kind of the weight of your attacks so that it communicates to the player, hey, I'm actually doing something to the enemy. I'm not just like firing pellets and then like a magical health bar just disappears. Another technique that is used very often that we're going to discuss is anticipation, action, and recovery. So for the people who don't know like general animation, it's basically describing the windup before an action, the actual action itself, and then the recovery back to neutral from that action. So as you can see in this Dead Cells clip, there's a windup when he uses the whip where there's a long drawback where the whip goes back, but the action itself lasts like 1 frame, the big arcing motion. And then after that, there's another recovery animation where he pulls the whip back. By doing this, you give your animations a lot more weight and heft, so it feels like you're actually doing something rather than just moving through an action. And the final thing that I'm going to talk about is particle effects. Obviously, particle effects can give you a lot of, can improve your game a lot visually. Just communicating what's happening, also just giving your character like a feel that they're actually in the world rather than just some kind of sprite that's moving around the level. We're going to focus on anticipation, action, recovery, but just keep these two in mind whenever you're making your own game. All right. So, what am I talking about when I'm saying anticipation, action, recovery? So let's take our square for example. During the anticipation phase, you can see the square kind of like swashing down to prepare for a jump. Then during the action, the square will kind of leap up into a straighter position to show that it has done the action, it has jumps up. Finally, it will go into a recovery phase where it's going from this pose back to its original pose. So how can we use this to kind of communicate what the player is and give it a better game feel? So anticipation typically communicates the weight of an action. The longer your anticipation phase is, the heavier that action will feel. So, for example, the difference between using a sword where there's not much anticipation, just the wind up and then the slash, versus using a hammer where most games communicate that by winding up for a big swing and then going through with it. The longer your anticipation is, the more powerful an action will feel. However, that doesn't mean you should increase anticipation for every action that you're making. Some actions should be quick and short. So like, let's say just a quick jump or a quick jab. You don't want much anticipation for that because then it just feels kind of unwieldy. So next up is action. So action will communicate kind of the speed of your action. So let's say you have like a sword swing versus just, I don't know, a robotic hand just like moving across. The faster it moves, the more powerful it feels. But also you don't want to use this in isolation of anticipation. So for example, let's say we increase the anticipation by a lot, and then we shorten the time of the action. That'll communicate a large windup and then a powerful quick attack. That communicates a lot of power. Versus, let's say we have a very short anticipation and then we shorten the action too. That communicates kind of like a quick jab or a quick something that you just one and done, get it over it real quick. And finally, we have recovery. That's just like either communicating like the result of your action. So like, let's say the attack, the recovery would show them rearing back from the attack, and then like maybe effects that happen afterwards. Whatever. Recovery is mainly used just to get your character back to your original pose. So you can add flourishes here, but I'm not going to talk about it that much. So I'm going to talk about two ways to tune it. One is for quick action. So like I mentioned earlier, for a quick action, you typically want a short anticipation and a really quick action. So in this case, you might even just cut out the anticipation completely. Because for a quick action, you want that immediate feedback to the player. They press the button, the action immediately happens. So for For example, a jump. You don't want to spend a lot of time on anticipation for a jump. Otherwise, it feels like, okay, I've pressed the button and I have to wait like an hour for the character to just wind up and then jump. That doesn't feel right for a platformer. Nor like, let's say we're making a quick jab attack. Having a long anticipation for that just doesn't feel right because, well, you want a jab to feel immediate, punchy. You do it right away. Long anticipation delays that effect, and now you just feel like, okay, this is taking forever for me to do a really simple action. And then here, we've extended the recovery to kind of just show the effect of the attack or action. So let's say you have a jab and then you add particle effects to kind of show the power of the attack. So maybe like a dust cloud for a punch, or like when you jump, there's like dust particles that show up where you initially jumped. Also just recovering from the action. So typically for quick actions, you want to minimize the anticipation for snappy immediate feedback, and then focus on recovery to kind of show what that action did. On the other hand, let's say you want to make a action that has weight to it. In this case, you want to extend the anticipation, show that there's weight to the attack, that show that the character has to really wind up for that action. And then you want to keep your action short to communicate that, to kind of capitalize on that power. And then obviously your recovery phase. So recovery here can communicate like how taxing the action was. Let's say your character had to do a super jump. They had to charge up for that jump. They jump through the action, but obviously they have to recover a bit. So when they land, maybe they need to crouch to distribute the weight so they don't snap their legs. So a long recovery kind of shows how much that, what am I trying to say? The recovery shows like how much impact your action had. So as I said here, emphasis on the anticipation and recovery to show the weight of an action. And then you'll want to keep your action phase short to so that your action doesn't feel sluggish. Obviously, though, these are all rules of thumb. Depending on what kind of action you're trying to make, you'll adjust anticipation, action, and recovery in different ways to communicate how the action should feel. All right. So now that I've talked about animation, let's try it out in our little platform. So as you can see, if we go into the settings, if I go over here and turn on the animation, the character now has a really, really slow jumping animation. So let's tune this to make it feel a lot better. Does anyone want to try it out? Rock, paper, scissors. Oh, I'm sure. All right. So we open up the settings. We have three settings here. We have the anticipation time, the action time, and the recovery time. These control how long each of those phases will last. So you see how by lowering the action time, the action feels a lot more snappy and it gives it more power. So like, let's lower the action time all the way down. The action actually feels like it's happening now. The action happens really quickly, and the much of the animation is focused on the anticipation recovery. So let's say, for example, if you increase the anticipation all the way, and same with the recovery, You see now, like despite the action being very sluggish, it feels like the block is really charging up for that jump. So it winds up by like squishing down first and then jumping. But obviously we're making a platformer, so we don't really want a very long anticipation time. So one thing we can do, so if you scroll all the way down, you can actually skip the entire anticipation phase. So now you can focus on just the action and the recovery. So now, instead of having a long windup, we've exchanged that for really snappy movement. The moment he presses jump, the animation plays a beat. You kind of miss out on that kind of windup, but in exchange, you have better feeling controls. So yeah, feel free to mess around with that. Try to like adjust it to wherever you feel like is good for this platform. All right. Does anyone else want to try it out? Nice. All right, in the meantime, does anyone have any questions before we move on? We're not going to mention how I made it in like 4 hours at 4 a.m. Sleep is for the weak.
You
All right.
didn't you say for you're even not gonna sacrifice all health?
This is an SRS. This is a tutorial. All right. What? Oh, whoops. Yes, I should make some co-hosts. All right, can you hold off on the controls for a second? Yeah, just a little bit. Make cost. There we go. All right, does anyone want to try this out before we move on?
I have a question.
Yeah, go on.
So what if you're trying to gravity more like deceleration? That's like you're jumping down the possibility.
So like make the gravity heavier when you're falling.
Yeah.
So yeah, in this demonstration, I didn't code that in, but you could definitely do that like in your own game where you adjust the gravity to feel like you fall a lot faster. So remember, all these settings that I've applied, these aren't static things. Like by adding these sliders in, I'm trying to communicate that like a lot of these things can be tweaked and adjusted. You don't have to just use whatever the base, like, oh, add velocity and then set the rigid body gravity to a certain amount and just work off that. You can adjust all of these components to make the game feel better. Like, does anyone want to go back to the original platformer? You want to go back? I can pull it up. We have a volunteer. Hold on. All right, let me pull up the original platformer. See how that feels compared to our tuned platformer. Give it a second to boot up. All right, man.
Oh yeah, this is so good.
Uh,
Yeah.
Anyone want to play this? Oh, don't have enough jump height, man.
Oh.
All right, but can you guys see like the difference between what this is versus after we tuned all of these aspects of the controls to make it like this? The difference in movement, the difference in the animation, you can see like you're actually jumping, you feel that. Also, you feel in control as you're playing. All right. So the last aspect that I want to talk about is balancing in very heavy quotation marks, because not exactly balancing, it's more balancing for the towards the player's favor. So if you ever heard of the phrase, the customer is always right, well, in game design, the player is always right. It doesn't matter how accurate their actions were. Let's say they were like a pixel off the ledge, so they technically couldn't jump. It doesn't matter. You're trying to deliver a player experience, and you should try to you should try to make your game in a way that it caters to whatever the player expects. So for example, if they were just like a pixel off the ledge, you should still allow them to jump because that's kind of what they expect. Not a lot of players will say, oh, I messed up because I was a pixel off. The more common response is, hey, this game is kind of broken. even though all of the aspects of the game are working perfectly, it won't feel that way to the player. So sometimes you have to sacrifice the accuracy of your game to cater to the player's experience. Or in other words, cheat in the player's favor. So there are a couple of ways that games do this. Taking Celeste, for example, Coyote Time. How many of you have heard of Coyote Time? Okay, good. So for the people who don't know what Coyote Time is, it's based off like I think the Looney Tunes cartoon, where I forgot the name of the character, but Wile E. Coyote. Thank you. I am not. I don't watch many cartoons, but Wile E. Coyote has a kind of famous scene where he's running off a cliff, and there's a brief moment where he's still running despite being completely off the ground. So in game design, we call that Coyote Time, where even though the player is very clearly off the ledge at this point, we still allow them to jump, giving them a bit more leeway to make the game feel better. So another way that we can improve game feel by cheating in the player's favor is input buffering. So as you can see here, even though the character hasn't actually touched the ground here when the player has pressed jump button, the game still gives them that little bit of leeway so that it keeps that jump input so that when the character actually hits the ground, it immediately unloads the jump from the buffer and lets them jump immediately after. This kind of prevents the cases where, like, let's say your player was just like a pixel off the ground and they press the jump button and the jump doesn't register. So obviously the player missed the jump. They weren't on the ground, they couldn't jump. But take a guess of what the player is going to say. Something along the lines of, oh no, the jump button's not working properly. Why is it dropping my jumps? It's not. You didn't jump on the ground. But to make the game feel better, we'll buffer that jump so that the next time they touch the ground, they'll jump anyways. Obviously, there's going to be a limit to that. So like, you don't buffer the jump when you're all the way up here. That doesn't make any sense. But if they're just like a couple of pixels off the ground, we'll keep that jump in memory so that the next time they touch the ground, they'll jump immediately. So it still feels like they jumped at the correct time. So in this case, for our little platformer demo, I didn't give you the ability to kind of adjust those very specifically, but I did consolidate that to a little checkbox called cheats. So Let's try without the cheats first. So does anyone want to demo? Takers. All right. So go back first. And just do a couple of jumps in place for me. It's like jump in place. Try to time it so that like when it, like you're just jumping without having to mash the button. All right. So now let's compare that to when we turn on the cheats. So for the sake of this demonstration, let's turn up the gravity. Oh, gravity. Let's turn down the jump height. So it's more expand with this. So if we turn off the cheats, and I just try to jump in place. Occasionally, like where like I expect to actually jump, but it doesn't have to. Whereas if I turn on the cheats, the game now buffers the input. So even though that I'm not actually touching the ground, it still keeps my jump and then registers at the next point I touch the ground. So another thing that I'll demonstrate is Coyote time. So let's turn off the cheats and let's try to jump off this platform. So let's say like I missed the jump by a little. Oh, no. I can't jump off a platform. Let's turn off the jump height a bit. There we go. So I'm gonna try to jump off the ledge on like the very last item. The inputs to it doesn't actually register to jump because like obviously I'm not touching the ground the moment like I leave the edge of the platform. On the other hand, if I turn on the cheats, even though like I'm clearly on, a bit too fancy. Even though I'm like clearly, let's turn on speed. So there you can see, like, even though I was clearly off the platform, it still allows me a brief grace period to jump. So that, let's say like you have a really tight platformer where they have like, where you're basically jumping from the edge of the platform to the other edge of the platform. Even though like your player might have missed the jump completely, it gives them that bit of leeway, so it feels a lot better. All right. So yeah, that is cheating. So that is the end of the workshop for now. Please fill out this winter workshop feedback form. I am obligated to say this as an officer.
This is how you get points for SRS, by the
This
way.
is how you get points. If you
don't
guys
get
want
credit if you don't fill out the form.
if you guys want free stickers, fill out this form.
Small SRS team with points gets free stickers.
And possible more prizes in the future to be determined.
Other fabulous prizes to be shown.
All right. That being said, although the lecturing portion of this tutorial is over, we're not quite done yet. So I've mentioned two games a lot previously. So I mentioned Celeste a lot. So I've used a lot of Celeste gifts, input buffering, coyote time, and then also just the particle effects. Also in the announcements, we mentioned Hollow Knight, another really good game with really tight controls. So I didn't bring this controller here for no reason. We are going to play Celeste and Hollow Knight together, just so you all can get a feel of what these controls are like in a real game. So, does anyone want to start off? Alright, think you have. Let's go. Which game do you want to play?
It's less more recent, so I'm like. July.
Okay. Let's turn on the game. Also, just a quick other thing on the slides, I did link the demo that I showed here. If you want to mess with it yourself, just go to the slides, very last slide. The link is at the very bottom here. All right. It is gamer time. We are playing games now. All right. Let me adjust some settings. I'm an addict. Don't worry about it.
All the golden strawberries, what are you doing?
I'm sorry, I'm not good enough for you.
Where's that golden rainbow? I've got a lot of eyes watching. No death run.
No death run.
That all strawberries.
All right, that being said, oh yeah.
It's been like 3.
That being said, if anyone needs to go, this is the end of the tutorial, but if you want to stay for the games, feel free to do so. We'll pass the controller around and we'll just talk about how the
This is what record facing.
Thank you very much.
apologies for the technical difficulties. Controllers are weird.
Yes, I highly recommend Source. I'm probably gonna be so bad right now because it's extremely hard.
No, yeah.
I'm gonna. Let's see. No, yes. Oh, this is my favorite game.
Setting the time.
There you go.
Start replay.
Record pace.
World record base? No, I'm not playing anyone that speed run right now.
I do have the timer on, so let's see how quickly.
Necessary stress.
So a couple of principles just right off the bat. You feel like when battling the main character is jumping, there is a bit of squash and stretch to show the kind of power of the jump. Also, before when the giant block fell, there was a bit of screen thing. Communicate feedback wise that like something's happening.
Oh, that's so funny. 50%.
Have a charger, don't worry.
Let's see how many times I don't put in the right dash. I love the Celestials. So good.
While they're going through the level, see how many things, see how many principles that we discussed earlier you can point out. We're gonna go for all strawberries.
Where are the downloads for the
Right? On the slide, I uploaded it. Like where? So one thing I do want to point out, notice how like every time you battle and dash, there's a little bit of screen. So if you can just like dash upwards real quick. Yeah, there's a really tiny bit of screen shape just to give the dash a little more. You keep going. Sorry. What? You don't have to dash.
Okay, yeah, that was the first one.
You get to dash for that last
Yeah.
part.
Oh, yeah.
You should probably make it more obvious. Because it's like in the bottom right corner of like the very last slide. It's not, I'm just telling you this. That's not what.
You want to emphasize it more? I mean, I could.
Well, yeah, just for like demo, bottom right corner. It's like not just like.
All right, one thing I want to point out. So, if you platform them, so if you jump off of a big platform, it does kind of visually communicate that you want to boost and momentum the platform by having these concentric trail behind you, battling when you jump. So that's another way to kind of give feedback to the player that hey, you did a successful jump. Anyone else want to try that?
I would suggest all my
So yeah, you can see there, like when you get a boost off of the moving platforms, there's a couple of circles that show up to really communicate that you definitely got the boost off the platform. It's a bit of visual communication that gives you more feedback and betters the game feel.
As banger as the soundtrack is, I think it's a little hard to hear you over the game.
Yeah. I'm not a very loud person, so let me turn the volume down. Yeah, Celeste very strongly uses like particle effects to really communicate what they're doing. So obviously there's a dash where you kind of get shadows of Madeline to show the speed of the dash. Oh, that strawberry is hard.
Oh
That's, like,
yeah,
first
no,
time.
that was painful. I remember spending like quite a while on that winter and I started.
Almost. You just have to be a little bit quicker.
Oh no. But like, it's awesome.
Oh, so close. Oh, nice.
Hey!
Oh!
No! So close.
Oh
my God.
Oh.
For strawberry.
Yeah.
Oh,
No.
that could work if you like jump off like as it's going back. Jump. Oh. Hey, let's go. All right. I think we call it here. So moving on to Hollow Knight. Does anyone want to try out Hollow Knight? Where is it in my Steam library? There we go. We'll try Pico Park another time. All right. Does anyone want to try out Hollow Knight?
Morty, this is a pretty fun. I've never played this game. I'm gonna do great. Trust.
Beginner's luck. Let's go. I have issues. Wait, no, hold on.
Oh, sorry. Should I skip this or do we want to?
Yeah, it's good because the Hollow Knight world, and you need to hear it.
Anyone want Boss Fight videos?
Yeah, no, Hollow Knight and Celeste supremacy.
Yes.
That's like the best.
That's crazy. So that's crazy.
Best kind of character design. So have a little guy,
Okay, I didn't even-
little guys, pretty large.
That's
Get the grass, get the grass. Yeah.
Yeah.
they're winning.
You won. Kill.
So just now, you can see how like they use kind of both just like flashing, but also a brief pause to extenuate like the effect of getting hit. So you really feel like you got damaged at that moment.
Sure. I've never been frustrated more than
The sound design is also so good. Thank God.
That's one thing I didn't get to mention during the presentation. So like sound effects can also really give your game a better feel, especially just like these like accenting certain actions. For example, like the splashes.
This is what I experienced.
Fun fact, Hollow Knight was made in Unity.
Yeah, so with enough experience and effort, you could potentially make this.
That's like some funny week. You know, we sent them to try.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't like how this camera is. This sets up actually.
Yes, you need to play.
I need to play one.
You need to play both.
And then
That's a green
Canon.
They're both extremely.
no,
But.
I've been through enough.
I said.
Get it.
Older brother.
Does anyone want to try to point out like how Hollow Knight feels versus how Spark? Give it your best shot. There's no correct answer.
Celeste is a little more floaty, I'm gonna say, like the gravity is it's pretty steep.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Anyone that's not.
I've never played Hollow
Yes,
Knight.
you got this.
What are the
Hollow
buttons?
Knight, congratulations.
Yeah, okay. I'm starting this.
It's the first time.
So yeah, like you can see that Hollow Knight has a much, it's much slower and also kind of, it's a lot stiffer,
Yeah, it's
but it's,
There's a lot less motion going on the screen.
yeah, so like, you could, in some games that's a bad thing, but for Hollow Knight, it's beneficial since Hollow Knight is very combat based. You don't really want to be moving all over the place while you're trying to attack. It lets the player focus a bit more on like what they're trying to do. The difference between Celeste is kind of like it's fixed on a full level. You can see the entire screen, so you have kind of that ability to just move around a lot more without.
Why is it telling me to hold B right now when I can't? I know, but I can't. Wait.
that's how you get your health back.
Yeah.
It's one of the fun.
Which one is B?
The one on the right.
Oh. Sorry, I'm a Nintendo gamer, so I'm like pushing the jump button as B.
I have my four guys to one.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Like,
It's just,
so games with the trigger.
I'll just ignore like the prompts and figure out the button. I think more. Oh, the more. Oh, is this wrong? Wrong. You know something. So good. Aladdin. Oh, I can read this.
Break.
Destruction? Oh, is that? Oh.
One thing that I think like both Hollow Knight and Celeste benefit heavily from is like not having an hour of cutscenes before the gameplay starts. It kind of throws you in directly to let you just learn the controls.
Yeah.
Celeste.
Yeah, unlike Celeste, they don't prompt you. Oh.
No, no, this-
Let me just feel a little bit.
I admire this.
You know what? You know, you can do it. Go for it.
Yeah, go. Jump.
Oh shit. You know what? I'm gonna come back later. Let's just come back later. Or does somebody else want to try to beat that guy? Ominous. Okay, it's just gonna creep ominously under me. That's
Oh,
cool.
don't want it.
Yeah.
Well,
You get an ability you don't have yet.
Okay, so I can't just.
Yeah.
Well, whatever you do.
So I do have to go kill that guy? No. No.
Ominous.
Played a platformer in a very long time.
Sound design.
It took me a while to get.
Oh my god, jail's for this guy.
Jail! Jail! Oh my god, oh my god. That was like unfortunate series of events right there. Does anyone else want to play?
Can I try the bus? I'm kind of curious.
Trying to do
Maybe our kick is out. Scavenge this for us.
Yes, you're
Yeah, dude.
taste
I just don't have hiding right now.
It's very, I don't know what that's.
I want to cut you off.
Okay, it's all agree.
He's waiting for the bus.
All right, so that was Hollow Knight and Celeste. Does anyone want to comment on the how the controls felt for both of those games?
The jump felt very high until you actually got close to the platform. Oh, it's not that high.
Yeah, Hollow Knight's controls are a lot better compared to Celeste. But in exchange, Hollow Knight is very combat based, so the entire controls give you more control over, for example, spacing the companions. Anyone else? The things you've noticed about the two games.
It's more or less very intuitive, at least directionally. After button mashing a little bit.
Yeah, so both games, they do kind of use the control scheme that I discussed earlier, where they separate out kind of your movement onto the D-pad and all the actions are on the base buttons. So it's easier for people to grasp, obviously D-pad movement and then actions on the other.
Plus, there's something that I love to do to hide development is putting a screen shake on everything to make it feel like a little bit more tactile.
Yeah, screen shake is a really good tool.
It's so satisfying and it's so easy.
Just make sure One thing about screen shake though is know when to use it. You use it a lot, but use it in moderation too, because too much screen shake is just like seizure inducing. All right. But anyways, that is the official end of the tutorial. So again, please fill out the feedback form. Obviously fill out the feedback form for like your SRS points, but also if you enjoy this style of tutorial where like I do a quick lecture and then I bring like 2 or 3 games for everyone to play, definitely fill out the feedback form. The more positive feedback I get, the more they'll let me do this type of stuff. So
Unironic.
if I get a lot of good feedback, I can bring more games. So I have a whole Steam library to prepare. So yeah. All right, but thank you. That is the end of the tutorial.